December 27, 1925. 100 years ago. President will ask Congress for funds for arms meeting. President Coolidge is preparing to ask Congress for funds to support American participation in an upcoming international arms conference under the League of Nations. It has become known that Herbert Hoover, Secretary of Commerce, is on a tentative list of delegates from which the President expects to choose the personnel of the American mission. Mr. Hoover's varied experience during the World War and his continued familiarity with international economic and political conditions since joining the cabinet are believed to make him a valuable choice. His name is also well regarded in many parts of Europe, where his work is remembered with admiration. Another development today came when President Coolidge informed Representative Martin B. Madden, chairman of the House Committee on Appropriations, that he would soon request Congress to provide funds to cover the expenses of American representatives attending the preliminary meeting of 18 nations in Geneva this February. This meeting is intended to arrange for the League's formal disarmament conference. Representative Madden stated that when Congress reconvenes early in January, he will introduce a measure to meet the President's request. He expressed the belief that $75,000 would be sufficient to cover the costs of the preliminary meeting. He added that if American representation were limited to an ambassador or minister already in Europe, along with technical advisors and secretarial staff, the expense might be lower. "We can afford to join the conference," Mr. Madden said, "unless participation requires the United States to surrender part of its sovereignty or the right to determine when and where it may join in any joint movement that threatens war." He continued that participation might benefit the nation by allowing the facts of peace efforts to be presented clearly to the world, and by keeping the American people informed so they may judge issues affecting their welfare, their taxes, and the chances of future wars. Mr. Madden further stated that meaningful reductions in armaments would represent the most important step toward peace and economic stability in Europe. He noted that previous reductions, agreed upon at the Washington Conference, were largely limited to battleships. Any real reduction, he said, would need to include submarines, fast cruisers, aircraft, and aircraft carriers, vessels that are costly and short-lived. The list of potential delegates under consideration by President Coolidge is described as tentative. There is no indication that all those named would necessarily serve. However, the inclusion of prominent figures such as Secretary Kellogg, Elihu Root, Charles Evans Hughes, Senator Borah, Senator Underwood, Representative Porter, and several leading Democratic members of Congress indicates the President's intention to make the mission one of high distinction. Particular attention in Washington is focused on the President's desire to include Senator Borah. There is surprise among some observers at reports that the senator may refuse appointment under any circumstances. Supporters argue that Senator Borah's position as chairman of the Committee on Foreign Relations and his strong advocacy of reducing the dangers of war through disarmament place upon him a public duty to participate. They also contend that his presence would allow him to clearly present any resulting treaty to the Senate. At the earlier Washington Conference on the Limitation of Armament, the American delegation included Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes, Senator Lodge, former Secretary Elihu Root, and Senator Underwood. From the size of President Coolidge's current list, it now appears that the American delegation to the League's conference may be larger than before. Coolidge broadens farm relief policy to provide markets. President Coolidge has broadened his farm relief policy to include providing markets for surplus crops, while stopping short of committing the government to price fixing or permanent participation in agricultural marketing. The President is prepared to endorse legislation that would allow surplus farm products to be sold during times of emergency. At the same time, he has made it clear that such measures must be carefully limited and must not result in the government taking over the regular business of marketing farm goods. This shift in policy comes largely in response to pressure from the corn-producing states, particularly Iowa, whose representatives have urged the administration to recognize the urgent need for practical relief through assistance in finding markets for excess crops. According to those familiar with the President's views, any legislation supported by the administration would be strictly an emergency measure. It would be designed to address temporary crises caused by abnormal surpluses, rather than to establish a permanent system of government marketing. President Coolidge remains firmly opposed to price fixing, believing that it would lead to excessive government control of agriculture and weaken the independence of farmers. He is also opposed to placing the government in the role of a regular buyer and seller of farm products, which he believes should remain a function of private enterprise. delegations from Iowa and other western states have forcefully presented the farm situation to the administration. They argue that without some form of federal assistance to help dispose of surplus crops, farmers face continued losses and growing economic hardship. The Iowa delegation is expected to carry the president's revised views to a Western agricultural meeting, where the administration hopes to demonstrate its willingness to cooperate while maintaining firm limits on government involvement. Administration officials emphasize that any aid offered would include strict safeguards to prevent abuse. Assistance would be provided only when clearly justified by emergency conditions and would be withdrawn once normal market operations could resume. While the president's position represents a broadening of his earlier stance, it falls short of proposals advanced by some farm leaders calling for extensive federal control over agricultural marketing. President Coolidge remains convinced that lasting agricultural prosperity depends on improved efficiency, diversification, and cooperation among farmers, rather than reliance on government guarantees. Cold wave hits city. Mercury 16 above. A sharp cold wave settled over New York City and much of the country today, sending temperatures downward after a comparatively mild Christmas. The mercury stood at 16 degrees above zero in the city, with forecasts calling for a further drop to 12 above. In two upstate towns, temperatures as low as 18 below zero were reported. The cold was felt throughout the Northwest, where shivering conditions were widespread. In parts of Minnesota, temperatures of 30 degrees below zero were recorded, making it one of the coldest regions in the country. Chicago reported 6 deaths attributed to the cold, as freezing weather tightened its grip on the city and surrounding areas. Hard on the heels of the Christmas holiday, the sudden change in temperature caught many unprepared. After relatively mild conditions earlier in the week, the mercury dropped rapidly, bringing bitter cold overnight. In New York City, the temperature early yesterday morning stood at 27 degrees. By mid-afternoon, it had fallen sharply, and by evening, the mercury continued its downward movement. Throughout the Northeast, the cold extended into neighboring states. In Massachusetts, temperatures dropped to zero in some communities. In New Hampshire, sub-zero readings were reported, while Vermont experienced similar conditions. Snow accompanied the cold in several areas, with light snowfall reported in parts of the state. Despite the cold, no serious interruption to transportation was reported, though city officials urged caution. While the cold seemed severe, following the mild Christmas weather, officials noted that it was far from record-breaking. The lowest temperature recorded in New York City for the day after Christmas occurred in 1914, when the mercury dropped to 4 degrees above zero. Yesterday's average temperature of 22 degrees was lower than that of the same day last year, which averaged 18 degrees. The mercury showed a brief rise during the early morning hours before turning downward again as the cold wave continued its advance. That concludes today's broadcast for December 27th, 1925. We will return tomorrow with the news of December 28th, 1925, on 100 Years Ago Today, where history repeats.